Good morning. I'm Pastor Clark Kelsey, and welcome to the 8th message in the Chicken Room Sermon Series. If you have your Bibles, please turn to Genesis chapter 12. And I encourage you to get a piece of paper so that you can write down anything that God impresses upon your heart during this message. Well, today is Mother's Day 2020, when we honor mothers for the great importance that they play in our lives. And studies show that by 7 years of age, 90% of a person's values and character are set in place. Think of that. By 7, a person is largely the way they're going to be for the next 70-odd years. And who did God intend to have the most influence over children in that time period? Their parents, with mothers being the ones who usually have the most time. This means if you gather all the mothers of a nation together, you'll have the single most important group of people to influence that nation's future. Mothers shape the lives of its future citizens, which means a nation stands or falls on the quality of its mothers. Well, today we're looking at a quality wife and mother from the Old Testament in the Bible. She lived in the Old Testament, but she is praised twice in the New Testament for being a godly woman. And our purpose today is to look at how God made her into a godly woman. Like all of us, she started far from God, but He came to her, and all along the map of her life, He dropped challenging situations. A challenge here, a challenge there, a challenge over there. All meant to stir her to faith in Him, move her toward Him, and create godliness within her. And yes, God still does that today, dropping faith challenges all along the map of our lives to stir us to faith in God and create godliness in us too. So today we're looking at the topic of how God makes godly people. And by the end of this message, you're going to learn 5 faith challenges God uses to draw us into Himself. Maybe you are going through one of those faith challenges right now. Let's all then listen up as we look at how God makes godly people. And we're going to do this by looking at the life of one of the most godly women in the Bible, the life of Sarah. The woman we know as Sarah started out life with the name Sarai. And we first meet Sarai in the city of Ur, one of the port cities just off the Persian Gulf. Here she lived in a wealthy home with her husband, Abram. And one day God came and spoke to him. Genesis 12 says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. And the ones who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed.'" What an astounding event. Imagine this evening that God comes to you and speaks to you and says, "Look, I'm going to make a great nation from you and make your name great in all the earth and bless all the nations of the world through you." That would be staggering. But, God says, there's one hitch. You have to pack up your bags and leave your home, and leave your relatives, and move to an unknown country. Would you leave everything behind and go? Well, maybe that would depend on which country He wants you to go to, right? But actually, you don't get to know that. God leaves out the destination and only says to Abram, "Go to the land which I will show you." Now, moving is no fun to begin with. But imagine packing up all your family and goods and heading out to where? In which direction? You have no idea. Someone made the comment that that would be harder on a wife than a husband. Wives, imagine your husband comes home saying, "We need to pack up everything and move, but I don't know where." Well, we'll just have to trust God. Sarah's reaction is not mentioned in these verses, but we know it was a challenge to her faith to step out into the unknown like that. And that was her first stop in Sarah's growth in godliness. Number 1, stepping into the unknown. Stepping into the unknown. Why didn't God tell them where they were going? Well, that's the way a faith challenge works. God leaves out an important detail in order to develop trust in Him. God could have said, "Abram, take the road to Haran, and then go to Hamath, and then go on down into Canaan and go to the inn in Jericho and unpack your bags and you'll be there. That is the type of clarity that I would have wanted. But God left out those details. Why? To have them put their trust in Him. Imagine option one. God gives them a detailed map of how to get there, and they take it and make it there safely, and they say at the end, wow, that worked. God's maps are really trustworthy. Or option two. God gives no detailed map, and they move forward down the road that first day and come to the first fork in the road, and they look to God. And He shows them, take the left fork. And then they travel down that road for a day or so until a second fork, and then they look to God, and He says, take the left fork again. And on and on and on, God showing them just enough to take the next route, to make the next decision, but not more. And once they finally get to Canaan, how would it be different if they had had a detailed map? They would know God the second way. Constantly seeking His direction, constantly waiting on Him for answers, constantly interacting with Him, and doing that mile after mile on the long trip. God chose the second method so that Abram and Sarai would press into Him and know Him and learn to trust Him. And God still uses that method today. He will bring us to a challenge of faith where we need to step into the unknown. We face college, or marriage, or retirement. We lose a job, we lose our health, our house burns down, and we don't know what lies ahead. We want detailed directions about what to do next, but instead, God leaves us with unanswered questions. Will we panic and run from the unknown in front of us? Will we dig in and refuse to move? Or will we step forward in peace because we believe that God will be there for us? Proverbs 3:5-6 tells us what to do in a faith challenge. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, that is, open the door for Him, and He will direct your paths. You know when you're walking with someone and you both come to a door at the same time, and the polite thing to do is to hold the door open for the other person to go through? That's what God is saying. God promises that if you hold the door open for Him to go through before you, He will direct your life. So Sarai stands here with her husband before a faith challenge to step into the unknown. There are many wives who would never consider doing such a thing. But apparently Sarai did. 1 Peter 3 tells us this. Wives, you must accept the authority of your husbands. The holy women of the past were submissive to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her master. You are her daughters, if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. This is that when Sarai got married, she accepted that God's map for her life included following her husband's leadership in marriage. That becomes God's map for every woman who becomes a wife, to now follow her husband's leadership in marriage. This was one of the two things for which Sarah is praised in the New Testament. Sarah is praised for, number one, her faith in God, but number two, her following her husband's leadership. She's praised for that. Many today view that as weakness, but not God. Listen, God knows it takes incredible strength to let another person lead you. Many wives refuse to follow their husbands because they don't trust them. They think they're foolish. They think they make poor decisions. But listen, submission for a wife is not faith in her husband, but faith in God that He will work through her husband to accomplish what is best for her. And that includes even when he makes mistakes. Let me say that again. Submission for a wife is not faith in her husband, but faith in God that He will work through her husband to accomplish what is best for her, even in what she considers to be mistakes. Of course, every husband is imperfect and makes mistakes at times. And of course, every wife is wary when her husband comes home with ideas that sound bad. And part of the job God gives wives is to help their husbands see the bad choices and counsel them and urge them to make wise ones. And we husbands must listen to our wives because God often leads husbands through their wives. But when all the discussion and advice is over, God's finger of responsibility for the decision lands on the husband, not the wife. And unless the man is making a sinful choice, God's map for the wife is clear. He says, do what is right and do not give way to fear. Do what is right by following your husband's leadership and do not give way to fear. Giving way to fear is leaving God's map for your life, wives. Rejecting your husband's leadership is leaving God's map for your life. Unless a husband is making a sinful choice, wives must stay on God's path of following their husband's leadership and exercise faith. Not faith in your husband, but faith in God. Faith that God rules your husband. God rules this world, God rules your life, God rules your husband, and that includes ruling his mistakes. Listen, God knows it may be important to let your husband fall through a certain bad decision that he's considering. You may see a mistake coming, but God may see that your husband needs to learn a life-changing lesson through that failure. A life change that won't happen if you dig in your heels and refuse to let him make it. Lots of women won't take that step of faith. They're going to control their marriage and make their husbands make the best decisions. That may sound like good thinking, but it is stepping off of God's map for your life and will lead to his disciplining you. Wives, put your faith in God and obey what he says. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. This is what Sarai did in this decision with Abraham. And what happened? Together, in spite of all the unanswered questions, they stepped forward into the unknown. And it worked. God safely led them to Canaan and gave them a great inheritance, an inheritance that their descendants have today. But that was just the first stop on Sarai's growth in godliness. Abram and Sarai settle down in Canaan, but then a famine hits. The food gets scarcer and scarcer until it's gone, and now what do? Well, they hear there's food down in Egypt. So they head down there. And as they approach Egypt, Abram grows a little worried. Genesis 12:11 through 13 says, it came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai, his wife, see now, I know that you are a beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me. But they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. Okay, what is the next faith challenge in the road? Threat of death. The threat of death. What was the unanswered question here? They have to go down to Egypt for food, but if they go, he could be killed. And God does not give any answers for how to be safe. Unanswered questions? Of course, that is what a faith challenge is full of. God leaves us with unanswered questions and then watches us. Will we stay on God's map for our lives or leave it? Should they tell the truth about their marriage or lie about it? Which should they choose? To trust in the Lord with all their heart. And that means stay on God's map and tell the truth if you're asked. Instead, they lean on their own understanding, leave his path, and choose to lie. Now, yes, Sarai was Abram's half-sister. They were allowed to do that in those days. But Abram chose to lie about their being married and give the impression they were both single. And Sarai was guilty of lying about that too. But wait a minute, I thought wives were supposed to follow their husband's leadership. Yes, but wives are never to follow their husband's leadership into sin. Never follow them by leaving God's path for them. Sarai should have stayed upon God's path and said, officer, yes, Abraham and I are brother and sister, but we are also husband and wife. I'm certain she feared her husband might be killed, but she should have feared leaving God's path more. God ruled the situation that day. God ruled those officers that day. Sarai should have trusted in the Lord with all of her heart, not leaned on her own understanding, and stayed upon God's path of obedience and told the truth. By the way, didn't she already have God's promise that Abraham would not die? He had promised that he would be the father of a great nation, and that means he would not die that day or any other day until he had at least one son. They needed to fear leaving God's path for their lives. And because they lied and did leave God's path, Pharaoh's officers took Sarai away, and if God had not intervened, she would have been permanently lost to Abram. But God did intervene, struck Pharaoh and his household with disease, and Pharaoh returned her to Abram. That was the faith challenge of the threat of death. And you would think that lesson would have been permanently chiseled into their souls. But 20 years later, the scene repeats itself. By this time, God had changed Abram's name to Father of a Multitude, Abram, and changed Sarai's name to Mother of Nations, Sarah. These name changes underlined God's promise that they were going to have lots and lots and lots of descendants. And then one day they're visiting the king of Gerar, and the king was attracted to Sarah and asked about her. And what does Abraham say? Genesis 20, verse 2. Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Once again they faced the threat of death, and whether to lean on their own understanding and leave God's path, or trust in the Lord and stay on his path. And once again they chose to leave God's path and lie. Now this lie is particularly bad because God had just changed their names to reaffirm his promise that they would have many, many descendants and therefore would not die until they had at least one son. Which means they did not need to fear being killed by the king of Gerar. But they did fear and lied anyway. And once again, God rescued them. Those were the second and fourth stops in developing Sarah's godliness. Threat of death. But there was a stop 3 in between. Genesis 16:1 says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar." God had repeatedly told Abraham that the map for his life included being a father, but God never really addressed the big problem. Number 1, Sarai was barren and could not have children. And number 2, even if her body had once been able to bear children, it was now too late. She was far too old. And here was faith challenge number 4, an impossible roadblock. An impossible roadblock. God promised them children, but he never answers how to get around the impossibilities. But that's what a faith challenge is full of. Unanswered questions. God leaves us with unanswered questions, and then he watches us. Would they lean on their own understanding and leave God's path for their lives? Or would they trust in the Lord with all their heart and stay on God's path? They chose to lean on their own understanding. Genesis 20, verse 2 says, "So Sarai said to Abram, 'Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her.' And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai." We have to admit that Sarai did not abandon God's promise that God would have a son. In fact, she was so willing to see it through that she was committed to the sacrificial act of sharing her husband with another woman. And yes, that was one way to resolve the problem. But it was the way of her own understanding, not God's path for her. She was stepping off of God's map for her life. God never asked her for her help. He promised it would happen, and he would make it happen. But the truth was, she had waited 1 year and no son. Then 2 years, and 3, 4, 5 years with no son. And then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years with no son. So it seems as if she felt she needed to make something happen. Too often we resent God's long delays like that in answering our prayers. So instead of waiting, we take matters into our own hands when God wanted us to wait for him. We forget that waiting is valuable. When we wait the right way, we press closer into God and seek him more and pray more and depend more, and that builds godliness. Yes, we have to keep our responsibilities that God gives us in a faith challenge. We can't ignore our part. But after we've done everything that we know to do, then we're to wait patiently by pressing ourselves into God. Sarai's 10 years of waiting were meant to be 10 years of pressing into God and seeking God. But instead, she says, look, God's not working, so we got to do something. And she convinced her husband to step off God's map for their lives with her. Waiting can be one of the most painful things that God asks us to do in our lives. It can seem that God has abandoned us and that we're all alone, but God promises that He's always right there, always ready to hold us and to strengthen us if we will stay on His path and press into Him. So stop number 4 ended with everyone involved getting hurt. Abram and Sarai and Hagar and even Ishmael, who was born out of it all got hurt in this scheme. All of it taught them the lesson that they must trust God with all of their hearts and not lean on their own understanding. Then stop number 5 took place many years later. After 24 years of waiting for the promised son, 24 years, God visits Abram's tent and tells him that Sarah is going to have a son the next year. Sarah's outside the tent listening. And it says in Genesis 18, verses 11 to 13, now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. And Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old? Hadn't God repeatedly promised Sarah that she was going to have a son? So why was she laughing at the idea that she would have a son? This was not a laugh of joy. This was a laugh of doubt. She clearly felt that since she was now 90 years old, there was no hope of ever having a son. I think we all know what it's like to give up hope. Satan throws his doubts at us and says that God's promises to supply all our needs may apply to some people, but not in your situation. That He may promise to work all things together for good, but this is not one of those times. Stop number 5 on Sarah's growth in godliness was hopeless difficulty. Hopeless difficulty. The unanswered question here was, how does God have a 90-year-old barren woman have a child? God does not give the answer. And that's what happens in a faith challenge. God leaves us with unanswered questions, and then He watches us. Would she lean on her own understanding or trust in the Lord with all of her heart? Sarah chose to lean on her own understanding. At least she started to, and laughed in doubt about God's promise. But the Lord quickly quiets Sarah's laugh with a question. Genesis 18:14 says, is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. God's question was meant to stir up Sarah's faith. Is there anything too difficult for the Lord? Is there anything too difficult for the owner of everything we know? Didn't He make all of this from nothing? Doesn't He rule all of it every single day? So why would we doubt that He can do anything with all of this, including breaking the laws of nature to keep His promises? God's question challenged Sarah to stay on God's path and believe that He can do anything. And she did. Hebrews 11:11 says, by faith Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered Him faithful who had promised. God challenged Sarah to believe that nothing was too difficult to stop the Lord from keeping His promises, and she believed. And today, Sarah is listed with the heroes of the faith. Hebrews chapter 11 talks about Noah, and Abram, and Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, and Samson, and David, and Sarah. She was not born a godly woman. Like all of us, she had to struggle and stumble her way forward in becoming godly. And her faith here activated God's power to conceive and give birth to a son when it was humanly impossible. And they named him Isaac, which means laughter. No longer the laughter of doubt, but the laughter of faith in a God who keeps His promises. The 6th And the final stop on Sarah's growth in godliness took place many years later. Isaac had grown into a young man, and everything looked so promising for God's promises to come true when God appears again. Genesis 22, 1 through 2. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Suddenly, without warning, God asked Abraham to kill his son. And here is faith challenge number 6. Death of a dream. Death of a dream. But God promised to create a great nation through this son. And now he tells me we're supposed to kill him? So there will not be a great nation after all? So God lied? The unanswered question here was, how could God keep his promise with Isaac being dead? God does not give the answer. That is what a faith challenge is all about. He leaves us with unanswered questions and then watches us. Will they lean on their own understanding and leave God's path for their lives? Or will they trust in the Lord with all their heart and stay on God's path? They chose to stay on God's path and obey in spite of not understanding. And here was how Abraham was reasoning. Hebrews 11:17 says, By faith Abraham offered up Isaac when he was tested, for he considered that God is able to raise men even from the dead. Instead of leaning on his own understanding, he leaned on the supernatural understanding of God that said that he was able to bring Isaac back from the dead. And I believe Sarah believed that too. The Bible tells us about the 2 times that Sarah lied when she faced a faith challenge. And it tells us about the one time she schemed her way around a faith challenge, and about the time she laughed in the face of a faith challenge. And I believe God would have told us here too if she had failed before this faith challenge. But it doesn't mention any resistance by Sarah. And I believe this was her greatest display of faith in God. We are not told of one word of protest as her husband and son disappeared over the horizon. And I am certain it is because by this time her faith in God had grown over the many, many years of being challenged and then challenged again by God. And through all of the success and all of the failures, she had learned one thing, that her God is trustworthy. And even if he asked her to give up the life of her only son, she believed that he is trustworthy. How many of us have a faith like that? We all know the end of the story. God spared Abraham from killing Isaac and greatly blessed them all for being willing to obey him. And in time, their descendants grew and grew and grew to become the great nation of Israel. And one of their descendants became the Savior of the world. So here is Sarah, the wife and mother. Like all of us, she started off life far from God, but she grew in godliness as she responded to the faith challenges God placed upon the map of her life. Are you facing any of the faith challenges Sarah did? Stepping into the unknown, a threat of death, impossible roadblock, hopeless difficulty, death of a dream. If you face any of these, it means you have unanswered questions. And God has purposefully left you with unanswered questions and then watches you. Will you lean on your own understanding and leave his path of obedience? Or in spite of all the unanswered questions, will you trust in the Lord with all your heart and stay on God's path? If you face a faith challenge today, do this. Number 1, tell God you trust him. Even though you have unanswered questions, just tell him that today. Number 2, turn back from stepping off God's path of obedience. Listen, can you say that you are on God's path of obedience in every area right now? If not, then get back on. Do what you know he wants you to do. Number 3, ask God for strength to stay on his path. It takes strength to stay on a path of obedience. Number 4, press into God as you wait for Him. Do all you know to do, and then wait. And then hold the door open for God to lead the way. In all your ways, acknowledge Him. Hold open the door for Him, and He will direct your paths. None of us started out life as godly people, but God is working to change that. He is working today to make you godly by placing faith challenges into your life. So choose today to trust in Him with all your heart. Learn these lessons from Sarah's life and stay on His path of obedience. Well, thank you for joining me today. Let's make sure we all take special care to honor the mothers in our lives for their special role. God has given us a great blessing to the lives of mothers. Happy Mother's Day, everyone. God bless you all.